So now that we have our enemy AI doing the base amount of work to get some basic gameplay going, why don't we move on into detecting collisions between our two characters' attacks? The next 3 videos are going to break it up between making our first initial collision script to detect attacks between our enemies. The next video will deal with taking damage as our player character. And the last video will be taking damage as the enemy. All right, so let's just jump into it. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a new script. So let's create a C# script, and let's call this attack collision. All right, and this script is going to be applied to a lot of different objects here. So why don't we just go ahead and get into our script by double clicking it before we start applying it, though. All right, so let's organize our script here. And since it's going to be a mainly on trigger enter collision script, we don't need to have void start and void update. But let's make some public variables real quick. Public bools, we're going to make bools. We're going to call one knockdown attack. And public float will be our attack's strength. All right. And we're going to make some private variables here. So game object, other object. This will be what we're actually attacking. And we're going to make a few more private variables in a little bit, but let's go ahead and get into the logic here, and then we'll go in and add our variables as we need it here. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to make our void on trigger enter function here. Set up your brackets just the way you like it. All right, so in our attack collision, what are we going to do? We need to set up conditions, don't we? Well, how are we going to tell the difference between what attack boxes are hitting what? We could call them by name, but I don't know. I don't like that idea. Why don't we, before we continue any further here, let's go back to our hierarchy. And why don't we start adding tags to some of these hitboxes and whatnot? So Gambit already has a player tag. Our Sentinel already has an enemy tag. But we need tags for our hitboxes and our attack boxes. So let's go to our tag drop-down menu. And let's go to our add tag, and we're going to add 4 new tags. The first tag being, let's see, player hitbox. And then we're going to make its counterpart enemy hitbox. And then we're going to have player attack box. And then you guessed it, the last one is going to be our enemy attack box. Hey, special note to the way you're spelling these and capitalization and spacing. That's going to be very important when you start calling them in your code. So now let's apply those tags to our different boxes. So I'm going to select my player's hitbox. I'm going to tag it as the player hitbox. Then I'm going to shift select all 3 of my attack boxes for my player. And we're going to make them player attack box. And just so we're clear on the difference between enemy and player attack boxes, I'm going to go in and I'm going to kind of edit up and clean up these names of these attack boxes real quickly. Because if we start using debug.log to kind of troubleshoot our code a little bit, it might be helpful to have our attack boxes and hitboxes with the correct name so we know the difference between what actual hitboxes are being called and whatnot. So basically I'm just typing in enemy and I'm copying that, pressing home and control V to update these attack boxes. It might be a little heavy-handed or unnecessary, but I think if you need to debug stuff, being able to exactly see which hitboxes are coming up in your console would be pretty handy here. All right, so now that we got that named, when do I continue my tagging efforts? So I got my player hitbox. It looks like I need to go to enemy hitbox next. And then shift select all these guys. And just going to double check to make sure everything's tagged just so. All right. looks like we're good here. So with my tag set up, I can now start really adding my logic to on trigger enter. And we really want to test for only two things right now. We only want to test if the player is hitting the enemy hitbox or if the enemy is attacking the player's hitbox. So those two conditions are what we're going to check for. So let's start with a conditional statement. So let's say if game object, which is the game object the script will be attached to, tag equals a player attack box. All right. And other dot tag equals enemy hitbox. Well, then what is this other? Well, we got to go back in. Remember on our trigger enters, we had to have this game object or the collider object with the variable name other, because whenever we collide with something, what we are colliding with is stored in this variable right there. So other tag, meaning if this hitbox, in this case the player attack box, if the tag equals player attack box and what I'm hitting is the enemy hitbox, then let's just put some code in right now. Enemy takes damage. And then we're going to do an else if game object dot tag equals, and then we're just going to flip it. Now we're checking for if the enemy is doing damage. Enemy attack box, and the other dot tag equals player hitbox. Then player takes damage. And then we're going to have an else return, like so. All right, so I don't think this will compile yet because if we're calling a condition, we're not looking for a comment. So we can't test anything yet. But what we can do is start making some functions of our own. Void, let's call it enemy take damage. And then why don't we just go ahead and set up our void player take damage. Now what we can do is we can, let's see, just call our enemy take damage function that we're about to do up, and we can just put in these calls here. All right, so now we're able to check these two things here. If the player is attacking the enemy hitbox and if the enemy is attacking the player's hitbox. I think I said that correctly. But why don't we do some debug.log stuff real quick, just so we can see that our logic's working. And we're going to say enemy takes damage. And I'm just going to copy this. And player takes damage. And I'm just going to see if my logic's working here. I'm going to press Control S to save it. Before I can even test that, I got to start applying this collision script to all these objects up here. So I'm just going to drag and drop it on the hitbox, all three attack boxes, basically anything that handles my collision, like so. And I'm just going to do a quick double check. I'm going to look for that attack collision. Looks like we're good. All right. So with that set up, our Sprite Atlas is packing stuff up. So what we should see in our console are debug.log messages telling us when our players hit our enemy. So if my enemy's attacking, all right. So something's not working quite right now. So why don't we go and see what else we have to add to get this to work. So there's a lot of things that it could be, but let's go with the obvious ones first. Let's just make sure that our hitboxes were not activated. So when our enemy was trying to attack us, there wasn't a red box for the green attack boxes to collide with. So I think that will probably do it. And our code controls whenever these attack boxes are active. So let's see what happens now. So with my attack boxes set up, boom. So you can see my debug.log just going 1, 2, 3 for every attack. And if I attack, now we're getting correct collision working between our player and our enemy. So before I wrap up this lesson, I'm going to set up a few more things to get ready for the next few videos. We need a stat script to hold information like health of the player and health of the enemy. So I'm going to drop that stats on the Sentinel, drop that stats on Gambit, and this is just going to be a simple little variable here. I don't even think we need void and update. We just want to be able to hold a public float health variable here. Hit Control S. So now our Sentinel will have a health value. We'll give him a health of like 25, and we'll give a Gambit a health of 100. And why don't we go in and give our attack boxes attack strengths. So with attack 1, which is my first initial jab, I'm going to give it a low damage value of 2. The second attack will be a little bit more powerful, so attack strength of 5. And the last attack is going to be a knockdown attack, and it's going to have a value of 10. And I'm just going to kind of do the same thing over here. 2 for the first attack for my enemy, 5, and then the last attack will be a knockdown attack, and we'll set it to 10. All right, great. The next thing we're going to do is we need to set up some variables where we can access different variables or different scripts on our player. So why don't we just go ahead and set up our player private object. So why don't we say something like, I don't know, Gambit controller script, and we'll call this player state, the state of our player. And then whenever our player takes damage, we need to say that first we need to be able to get at our other object here. So if when we go down to our void player take damage function, what we're going to say is other object. What is it going to be equal to? Well, that's a tough one because other right here. What we need to do is we need to be able to pass other, what we're colliding with, into our functions down here. So we're going to have to add some variables to pass between this stuff. So other.gameObject. So we're going to look at our other. We can't just say other because other is a collider, and we want to pass in the game object of player. This is so whenever our player takes damage. Let's see, is that what I want to do? Yeah, I think we're going to do that for each one. Game object. And then we're going to go into our functions up here. I'm going to say game object other. So just so we can pass in what we're colliding with on our scripts down here. So there we go. So other object, what is that going to be equal to? Well, that's going to be equal to other dot, and here's the trick right here. What we're actually colliding with when we're attacking our enemy, or our enemy is attacking our player, we're actually colliding with this enemy hitbox. But we need to be able to access our parent object, such as Sentinel or Gambit, because these parent objects in our hierarchy, they have all the necessary scripts we're going to have to access in order to fire off different states of animation and to adjust the health stat or any other stat that you might want to adjust based on what your attack is going to do. So what we need to do is we need to have a specialized form of code. We're going to say other object. And I'm going to go through the logic flow here in a second. I'm going to go ahead and type this in. We're going to say other.transform.parent.gameObject. So what this line of code does is it allows us to get at our Sentinel parent object. All right, so let's walk through our logic real quick, and then we'll go on to the next video. So let's look at it from our enemy's point of view. Our enemy is walking towards our player. Okay, our enemy is walking towards our player. All right, so he gets within attack range, and he fires off his first attack. All right, so when our first attack connects, we go to our void on trigger enter code, because all of our game objects here have our attack collision script attached. So we look at on trigger enter collider other. If the enemy attack box collides with the player hitbox, then we call our player take damage function, and we need to pass in what we're actually colliding with. So this collider other here says, okay, my enemy attack box is colliding with the other thing here. So we pass this other variable dot game object into player take damage. So what we're passing in here right now is our player hitbox. Okay. So we call our function player take damage. We're passing in our player hitbox, and we're setting our other object here. We're trying to find our root parent game object, which is Gambit right here. So to do that, our other object equals other, which is our player hitbox right here in the left on the hierarchy, dot transform dot parent game object. So these three guys right here, they help us point from the player hitbox to the parent object that it's hierarchied or grouped under. All right. So now other object equals transform.parent.game object. So let's do a debug.log to see that in action. So if our code's right, we'll say that the player takes damage, and we'll see a printed message of what our player object is. And it should say Gambit in our control window here. All right, so let's press play. And there we go. We get a message saying we have connected, the enemy has connected damage to our player. And we get our debug.log message saying, yes, the other object is in fact Gambit, which is our parent object for our player character, which has all the awesome information and components that we need to be able to access in the coming videos here. All right, so I'm going to end it here. We got a good setup with collision. We have both enemies and players being able to connect. We know how to access other object, and in fact, we can even go ahead and do that code right here. It's just the same code. All right, and we can even do something like this as well. So right now, all this code is accomplishing is we're testing what attack boxes and hit boxes are doing with each other. We're telling the console who's taking damage, and we've also been able to access our parent objects because our hit boxes are children of our parent, and it's really the parent that has all the juicy components over here. So if we test one more time, when my enemy attacks, it should say I'm taking damage, and it's saying who is taking damage. And if I attack, the enemy takes damage, and it points to who is receiving that damage as well, because our debug.logs are set up just so. All right, so that does it for this video. In our next video, we're going to control the logic behind Gambit taking damage. That means subtracting his health based on the amount of attack damage, attack strength of our attacks we're performing. And we're going to be able to call our animations, and we're going to be able to knock our Gambit, our player character, down. So that's what we'll be doing next video.